So at the end of the day, everybody wants the same outcome when they make a decision. They want the optimal outcome. How they get to that place varies depending upon where they are in their developmental brain cycle, if you will. And so younger people, middle school young people, are at a different level of brain development than high schoolers, than adults. And the data seem to show that there are two processes that everybody thinks about when they make decisions. There's the planning, thoughtfulness process, and then there's the emotional reactivity process. And so what you'll see when you look at the data are that younger people will use more of the emotional driven decision making and less of the thoughtful planning decision making, and older adults will use more of the thoughtful planning decision making and less of the emotional decision making. Well, most of us that are older know that when we make decisions based on emotion, they're usually not well thought out and they're not as good. And that's probably the biggest fundamental difference between young people and older people. That's not to say that younger people, that there aren't exceptions to that rule, and there are younger people that are very good planners, very thoughtful in the way they do things and less emotional. And there are adults that are very emotional and they don't really think things through. But on average, you'll see more adults that will be thinking about alternatives and then weighing the disadvantages and advantages of each of the alternatives. And then they'll have a little bit of emotion that comes into play because they've experienced that, life is full, life is better when you have some emotion involved. Younger people will be a lot more, how do I feel today? How do I feel about this decision? Do I feel like going to that party? Do I not feel like going to that party? And so one of the things that we try to do with young people when we work with them to help them be better decision makers is we try and shift it so that it's less feeling-based and more thought-based. And one of the approaches that I try to encourage people to do is to ask your kids questions about both thinking and planning as well as their feelings, so they can get both of them out on the table and they can work with both sets of information to make better choices. It turns out there are differences between middle school students, high school students, and adults in the way they make decisions. There's really two processes that involve most decisions that we make. One's an emotional one, and the other one's a thoughtful one. And the emotional one's how we feel about it, are we willing to do things, and the thoughtful one is really thinking about what are our alternatives? What can we do in this situation? How can we do this better? Should we get information that helps us make a decision that's better? Well, the thing that's important to realize from the beginning is that young people are not just smaller versions of adults. Their brains are fundamentally different. And what they do is they focus more on the emotions than the thoughtfulness. And adults tend to use more of the thoughtful and planning rather than emotions. And there's exceptions to that rule where younger people will be very thoughtful in the process and that older people will be more emotional. The way the brain works is that there's different centers that are involved in emotions versus thoughtfulness, and these centers are connected. But as time goes on and individuals have more opportunities to make these choices and use these processes, those connections become stronger. And that's why adults are more likely to use planning and decision making, where younger people are much more likely to react or be emotional. Oh, my friend's going to be upset. My parents are going to be upset. Somebody's going to be happier if I do this. And they're going to be much more likely to do things that seem like they're not thought out. So another question I'm commonly asked is, how does alcohol affect a young brain versus an older brain? There's a lot of different ways that alcohol affects a younger and older brain. But probably the biggest way is in the way that individuals make decisions. Most of the thoughtful planning decisions happen in what we call the frontal cortex, or the big part of our brain here. And usually the way alcohol works is it affects the periphery of your brain initially and then works its way more to the center core. So it has an effect on judgment and decision making because it's having an effect on your frontal cortex. The connectivity between the different areas or regions of the brain that have involved in thoughtful planning and emotional decision making, those connections are strongest in older adults. And so when alcohol is affecting an older adult, that connectivity between emotion and thoughtful planning is a little stronger than it would be with a younger person. And as a result, the connectivity kind of, I want to say it kind of goes away for a younger person, and kids become more likely to be emotionally based decision makers as opposed to thoughtful planning decision makers. And that happens in adults, but to a lesser extent.